Darkness. Snow. Silence. The forest of Luxembourg, December 1944. It was the deadliest winter Europe had seen in decades, and the German army was launching its final, desperate counteroffensive. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. On a lonely ridge outside the town of Lanzerath, a single American soldier wiped freezing blood from his eyes. His platoon was gone, wounded, dead, or captured. The snow around him was shredded by machine gun fire and mortar blasts. The enemy was advancing. Hundreds of German paratroopers, elite troops, were moving downhill toward a gap in the American line. If they broke through here, they would spill into the valley, threaten the supply routes, and split the Allied front wide open. One soldier stood in their way, Private James Jim Hendricks, 19 years old, a farm kid from Missouri with frostbitten hands, a jammed radio, and nothing left but his rifle, a few grenades, and a will of iron. He wasn't fighting for glory. He wasn't fighting for medals. He was fighting because if he failed, thousands of American soldiers would be surrounded. He took a slow breath. He aimed, and alone, he opened fire. Before the snow, before the gunfire, before Jim Hendricks was alone on that ridge, he was just a kid from a farm. Missouri, early 1940s. A gravel road ran past endless fields of corn and wheat. Jim grew up working dawn to dusk beside his father, splitting wood, feeding cattle, repairing fences. He didn't come from privilege. He came from dust and sweat, and the kind of work that turned boys into men long before their time. He learned to shoot the way other kids learned to ride a bicycle. He could hit a tin can from 200 yards, not because he practiced for fun, but because dinner sometimes depended on it. Every shot counted. Every mistake meant hunger. He had no idea that skill would one day decide the fate of an entire front line. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Jim Hendricks was 16. He heard the news over a crackling radio in the living room. His mother gasped. His father just stared at the floor. The United States was now at war. A war unlike anything anyone had seen. Jim didn't wait to be drafted. The moment he turned 18, he enlisted. He wasn't a superhero. He wasn't built like an action figure. He wasn't the kind of young man who bragged. He was quiet, calm, humble. But war was about to reveal what calm under pressure really meant. Basic training took the boy from Missouri and hammered him into a soldier. He joined the 17th Airborne Division, a relatively new unit destined for airborne assaults across Europe. Hendricks trained as a paratrooper, jumping from aircraft into cold wind and open sky, learning to land hard, move fast, and fight even faster. He proved to be a natural. The instructors noticed something rare about him. He never panicked. While other young soldiers tensed up during grenade training, Jim stayed loose. He handled explosives like tools, not toys. When firing his rifle, he didn't jerk the trigger. He breathed into the moment, letting the weapon become an extension of his hands. Calm, exact, controlled. His commanding officers began using him as a demonstration soldier. If they needed someone to show a maneuver perfectly, they pointed to Hendricks. When they trained close-quarters combat with live grenades, he was the one they trusted. But war does not care how well someone trains. Autumn 1944. The Allies had broken out of Normandy, and France had been liberated. Everywhere across Europe, people whispered the same thing. The war will be over by Christmas. Hitler heard the whispers too, and he was furious. Germany was losing ground, losing factories, losing fuel, losing men. But the Führer believed he had one final chance to reverse everything. He planned a massive, unexpected counterattack through the Ardennes forest, a brutal landscape of hills, trees, and narrow roads. To the Allied High Command, the Ardennes seemed quiet. The calm sector, a place where exhausted divisions rested. That illusion was exactly what Hitler needed. The objective was audacious. Punch through the American lines, push all the way to Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in half. If he succeeded, British and American forces would be isolated, supply lines severed, and perhaps, just perhaps, the Nazis could force a negotiated peace. On paper, it sounded impossible. In reality, the Germans had one advantage left. Surprise. December 16th, 1944. Before sunrise, the forest erupted. Hundreds of artillery pieces. Thousands of shells. The ground shook. Trees snapped. Foxholes collapsed. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. American units in the Ardennes suddenly found themselves overwhelmed. Columns of German tanks forced their way down icy roads. Waffen-SS divisions swept through villages and crossroads. In the chaos, strings of American soldiers were captured, entire units swallowed whole by the surprise offensive. The German advance was fast, violent, and determined. There was only one thing that could stop them: time. If the Americans could delay the enemy, even for a few hours, reinforcements could arrive. Patton's Third Army was already preparing to pivot north. The Allies had air superiority, and once the winter fog cleared, American bombers would return. But at that moment, on that morning, only the men on the ground could hold the line, men like Jim Hendricks. Jim's platoon, part of the 17th Airborne, was rushed forward to plug one of the critical gaps in the defense. They were young, under-equipped, and outnumbered. Many had never even fired a shot in combat. They reached the outskirts of a small Luxembourg village, Lanzerath. To them, it looked like just another snowy forest with a road cutting through it. But intelligence reports were grim. A large German force was moving their way, elite paratroopers from the Fallschirmjäger, trained, battle-hardened, and desperate. If they broke through here, they would gain access to a key road network and spread deep into the Allied rear. No one expected what came next. Jim and his platoon dug in on a ridge, frozen earth, shallow foxholes, no heavy machine guns, low ammunition. They had no idea the true scale of the German force approaching them. They were about to be hit by hundreds, and in a matter of hours, every soldier around Hendricks would fall, one by one, until he was the last man left holding the line. Alone, waiting. Ready. The ridge was quiet, that dangerous kind of quiet where every breath feels borrowed. Snowflakes drifted through the tree line. The sky was a sheet of dull gray. Jim Hendricks tightened the strap on his helmet and checked the sling of his M1 Garand. His hands were cold, but steady. Nerves didn't control him. They sharpened him. Nearby, his platoon leader scanned the forest through binoculars. Nothing. No armor. No marching columns. Just trees and wind. But Jim felt it. The stillness before a storm. He crouched in his foxhole, breathing slow, eyes fixed on the tree line. His sergeant crawled over and whispered, "Stay sharp. Something's coming." Minutes passed. Then the forest moved. Not the wind. Not animals. Men. Camouflaged uniforms. The mottled pattern of German paratroopers. Dozens. Then hundreds. They appeared from the fog like ghosts. Disciplined, silent, advancing in a perfect infantry line. Jim's heart hit his ribs, not from fear, from realization. This wasn't a probing patrol. This was the spearhead of an entire assault. His platoon, fewer than 20 paratroopers, was about to be hit by a force large enough to overwhelm a company. They were outgunned, outnumbered, freezing. The lieutenant whispered into the radio, voice quivering, "We have movement." Estimating. He stopped. His breath caught in his throat. "A battalion," the radio crackled back. "Hold your position. Hold. Against this." Orders were orders. The lieutenant nodded to his men. That tiny gesture, a tilt of his chin, meant we fight. The first German burst broke the silence. Machine gun tracers sliced the air. The forest erupted. Tree bark exploded. Snow kicked up like shrapnel. Jim fired back. Crack. One shot, one target dropping. He worked the rifle mechanically, steady, precise. While others panicked, Jim became calmer. The battlefield turned into a shooting range. And he was the boy from Missouri again, hitting moving targets from impossible distances. But the Germans kept coming. Grenades arced through the air and detonated in blinding flashes. Shouts in German echoed off the ridge as more men pushed forward. Jim's platoon fired until their barrels steamed. "They're flanking left. No, right." The platoon leader tried to coordinate, but chaos shredded the formation. A mortar landed near the command position and blew 2 men off their feet. The lieutenant didn't get back up. Leadership collapsed. The line began to crumble. Still, Jim fired. He wasn't thinking about heroism. He wasn't thinking about history. He wasn't even thinking about living. He was thinking about the next target. Rounds slammed into the logs shielding his foxhole. Splinters burst into his face. Jim ducked, reloaded, and rose again. Another German fell, then another. Then the ridge fell silent again, only momentarily. Because the Germans were adapting. They began maneuvering behind the ridge, pushing around the flanks. The platoon had no heavy weapons, no artillery support, and barely any ammunition left. Fall back! Fall back! Men scrambled out of foxholes, running toward a fallback point. A machine gun swept the ridge and cut several down before they took 3 steps. Jim stayed. Not because he was ordered to. Because falling back meant the Germans would break through to the road. And if that happened, the whole Allied line behind him would be torn open. He stood alone in the snow as the last of his platoon disappeared. He looked around and realized every foxhole was empty. Every rifle beside him lay in the snow, silent. He was the last man on the ridge, a 19-year-old soldier facing an entire German advance. He slowly pulled the pins on the grenades left behind by his fallen comrades. He lined them up beside him like tools on a workbench. He checked the M1 one more time, pressed his back against the cold earth, and exhaled. Then he waited. He could hear them coming, boots crunching through snow, commanders barking orders, branches snapping under dozens of advancing soldiers. Jim whispered to himself, not a prayer, not a cry, just one sentence. This ends here. The Germans rose over the ridge. Jim pulled the first pin. He stood up, and he charged them. He sprinted downslope into the teeth of the German assault, snow flying under his boots, grenades clutched in both hands. Shouts in German erupted across the ridge as soldiers spotted a lone figure charging toward them. Einzelner Soldat, a single soldier. They thought he was running away. They were wrong. Jim Hendricks yanked the pin from the first grenade with practiced ease and hurled it into the densest cluster of enemy infantry. The explosion blew a hole in their formation. He didn't wait to see the result. He was already pulling the next pin. Grenade, throw, move. Each one bought seconds. Tiny fragments of time that kept the German advance uneasy, disrupted, afraid. Soldiers dove for cover, expecting more Americans behind him. They assumed anyone attacking alone was a decoy. They paused, reorganized, scanned the tree line. That hesitation was everything. Jim wasn't fighting to kill them all. He was fighting to slow them down. Every second he stole was a second the Allies could use. He ducked into a shallow ditch and switched back to his rifle. The cold barrel pressed against his cheek as he fired, exhaled, and fired again. He wasn't spraying bullets. He was placing them, consciously, deliberately. The boy who learned to shoot to feed his family was now holding the fate of a front line on his shoulders. The Germans tried again. This time, 3 squads maneuvered to flank him simultaneously, moving through the tree line in a coordinated assault. Jim saw the pattern and shifted position. He didn't run. He relocated, leaving behind footprints that led nowhere. He used the terrain, the snow, the fallen logs, and the confusion. He fired from a new angle, making it seem like multiple Americans were still fighting. Confusion spread through the German ranks. How many are there? Where are they shooting from? In reality, it was just Jim. One man. 19 years old. And yet every time the Germans thought they had pinned him down, another burst of rifle fire cracked from a different direction. The snow muffled sound, the fog blurred sight. To the Germans, he was everywhere. He tossed his last grenade at a German machine gun team setting up to provide covering fire. It detonated under the tripod and flung the gunner backwards. Machine guns can turn battles. Jim knew he couldn't let that one fire even a single burst. Then his luck began to shrink. He reached for another grenade. Nothing. He checked his ammo. Nearly gone. The rifle bolt locked back. Empty. Jim dropped into the snow and crawled toward a fallen American paratrooper, stripping him of grenades and ammo. Machine gun rounds hammered the dirt inches from his head. A burst tore through his sleeve. He didn't flinch. Not because he was fearless, but because fear would get him killed. He loaded another clip into the Garand, slid behind a tree, and fired until the bolt locked back again. Then he moved, always moving, using every inch of ground as cover. The fighting became raw, close, personal. A German paratrooper rushed him with a submachine gun. Jim tackled him into the snow, ripped the weapon from his hands, and fired point-blank into the next soldier emerging from the trees. But numbers don't care about courage. The Germans eventually overwhelmed the ridge. They crawled bodies forward, leapfrogging through the snow, using each fallen soldier as a stepping stone. Slowly, steadily, they closed in. Jim knew it. He wasn't going to survive this ridge. But he wasn't done fighting. He fired another clip into the advancing troops. A German grenade landed near his position. Jim grabbed it, threw it back, and dropped into the snow as the explosion rattled the forest. A corporal from the German unit shouted to his commander, "We have them surrounded. Finish it, them." Even now, they still thought more Americans were here. Jim's entire goal, misdirection, had worked. He dragged himself to a new foxhole, only to realize something terrifying. He was alone. Every other position was silent. He pressed his forehead against the frozen ground. His heart pounded. He was out of grenades, nearly out of ammunition, and surrounded by enemy forces. Most soldiers would surrender. Jim Hendricks didn't know how. He remained on the ridge, shifting positions, firing when it counted, surviving when any sane person would have given up. Then, through the trees, he saw movement. Not Germans. American reinforcements. A small group of paratroopers appeared, sprinting through the forest toward his position. When they reached the ridge, they looked around at the chaos. Bodies. Everywhere. German gear scattered across the snow. Rifles abandoned mid-charge. "Where's the rest of your unit?" one of them asked. Jim pointed down the hill, toward the German advance that was now pulling back, regrouping. "I am the unit." They stared at him. He wasn't bragging. He was telling the truth. They had trouble believing him, that one man had stalled an entire German advance. Reinforcements spread out along the ridge, expecting to find foxholes packed with bodies or a machine gun nest that could explain the resistance. But the truth was undeniable. There were no positions left, no crews, no heavy weapons, just the trail of brass, broken branches, and footprints that all led back to one soldier's fight. Jim didn't celebrate. He didn't soak in the recognition. He simply stood there, breathing steam into the cold air, watching the movement below, because the battle wasn't over. The Germans regrouped in the valley, reorganizing, reloading. Even after what they'd just endured, their orders hadn't changed. Push forward, break the American line, seize the crossroads ahead. Jim's actions had stalled them, confused them, bought precious time. But now, they were coming again. The ridge started to shake with the rhythmic stomp of marching boots. The reinforcements looked to Jim, not because of rank, but because courage is contagious. He knew the terrain. He knew how the enemy moved. And most importantly, he knew what fear looked like when it controlled men. He'd seen it on the ridge earlier, not in himself, but in the eyes of the Germans. He carried no authority, but he had earned respect. One paratrooper asked, "What do we do?" Jim wiped the mud off his rifle and answered like it was the simplest thing in the world. "We hold." They dug fresh positions into the snow. Jim instructed them on fields of fire, overlapping arcs, fallback angles. He marked where the enemy would likely flank, where they'd place machine guns, where they'd try to break through. He saw the battlefield differently, not as chaos, but as a living pattern. He positioned himself at the edge of the ridge, the most exposed point. He knew the Germans would try to overwhelm that angle first. The other Americans begged him to move back, to take a safer foxhole. Jim shook his head. If they take this point, they take everything. There was no arguing with him. Then the trees below erupted once more. The Germans moved with renewed force, determined, angry, humiliated that their advance had been stalled by a handful of paratroopers. They pushed uphill with grenades, submachine guns, and light mortars, firing blindly into the ridge. But now, Jim wasn't alone. The forest roared with American gunfire. The reinforcement squad held firm, inspired by Jim's defiance. Every time a German soldier broke cover, someone dropped him. Every time a flanking attempt started, Jim redirected fire. He was becoming something more than a soldier. He was becoming a conductor, directing the battle like an orchestra. At one point, a mortar landed between two of the reinforcements. Both men went down, bleeding, unable to move. The others hesitated, fearing sniper fire. Jim didn't. He leapt from his position, sprinted toward the wounded, grabbed one soldier by the collar, and dragged him into cover. The second man was farther. Jim ran again, bullets clipping the snow around his boots. He hauled the man to safety as machine gun fire chewed the ground where they had been lying seconds before. Once back behind the lines, a medic yelled, "You're insane!" Jim didn't answer. He was already back on the ridge. Then the Germans tried something new. Smoke grenades. White fog rolled through the trees, swallowing the ridge in a ghostly haze. German paratroopers emerged from the smoke like phantoms. Their silhouettes flickered in and out of view. This was their specialty, close-quarters shock tactics. They expected fear. They expected panic. What they got was Jim Hendricks. He waited until he could see the whites of their eyes. Then he fired, calm, controlled shots. His rifle cracked like thunder in the suffocating smoke. The men next to him followed his lead, no longer thinking about surviving, but about winning. For a moment, it worked. Then a grenade landed inches from Jim's knee. Instinct took over. He grabbed it. He threw it back into the smoke. The explosion lit the fog like lightning. When the smoke finally thinned, the Germans were no longer advancing. They were retreating, dragging wounded men, shouting commands, pulling back down the ridge they had fought so desperately to take. The field was silent again. Snow drifted. Men breathed. No one spoke. The reinforcements stared at Jim, a farm kid from Missouri, as if they were looking at a myth. One soldier broke the silence. "You just stopped a battalion." Jim shook his head. "We stopped them." Hours later, when higher command arrived and assessed the situation, they were stunned. The German timeline had been shattered. Momentum, the most dangerous weapon of any offensive, was gone. One ridge, one platoon, one soldier who refused to break. Because he held that ridge, the German advance slowed. Because it slowed, reinforcements reached other critical junctions. Because they reached them, the Bulge never broke the line. Jim Hendricks didn't win the Battle of the Bulge, but he stopped the blow. That could have changed everything, and he did it by refusing to be anything less than unbreakable. Night dropped over the forest like a curtain. The temperature plummeted. Snow hardened into ice. The ridge that Jim Hendricks had defended, first alone, then with a handful of reinforcements, was now a graveyard of shattered branches and frozen shell craters. But the battle wasn't finished. The Germans had failed to break through during daylight, yet failure didn't mean surrender. Their orders were still the same. Seize that ridge, take that road, break the American line. The German commander could not return to his superiors and say, "We were stopped by a 19-year-old paratrooper and a few exhausted infantrymen." So, they prepared for another assault. One more, ruthless and relentless than before Jim knew they would be back. He stood at the ridge's edge with his rifle slung over his chest, scanning the shadows below. He could feel the storm building in his bones. Not fear, instinct. Animals feel it before a predator strikes. Soldiers feel it before an army attacks. Behind him, the reinforcements tried to rest, but no one slept. Men sat in silence, hugging their rifles, breath steaming in the air. Someone tried cracking a joke. It died halfway out of his mouth. Even the forest felt like it was holding its breath. Jim crouched low, stripping down his rifle, clearing the chamber, brushing ice from the bolt. He checked every grenade he'd collected, every magazine he'd scavenged from fallen soldiers. He wasn't preparing to defend the line. He was preparing to survive something bigger than a firefight. He was preparing to stop a final attack. Far below, deep within the trees, the Germans were making their own preparations. Orders were whispered. Mortars were repositioned. Machine gunners were briefed. The plan was simple: a night assault with no warning, using the darkness to overwhelm the defenders. A German officer murmured to his squad, "When they panic, we win." He didn't know the flaw in his plan. Jim Hendricks didn't panic. Just after midnight, a faint metallic ting echoed through the woods. Jim froze. That sound was unmistakable. The tap of a mortar tube being adjusted. Then it came, a streak of pale fire arced into the sky. Jim's voice cut through the stillness. "Incoming!" Mortars hammered the ridge. Explosions tore open the frozen soil, flinging dirt and ice into the air. The world became a strobe of fire and shadow. The reinforcements ducked into foxholes while shrapnel whistled over their heads. Jim didn't duck. He watched the barrage, tracking the origin point, calculating the angle. Mortars hid in patterns, and patterns can be predicted. He dove from cover to cover, using the gaps between impacts to inch forward, not away from the Germans, toward them. When the mortars stopped, the next wave started. Infantry. German paratroopers emerged from the darkness in staggered columns, rifles raised, boots silent in the snow. They crept halfway up the ridge before the first American opened fire. Jim waited. He forced himself to stay still. He didn't fire. Even when shapes appeared within arm's reach. He didn't fire when one soldier stumbled past him. He didn't fire when he could see the breathing vapor of an enemy less than 10 feet away. He fired only when he had to. One clean shot cracked through the trees. The nearest German collapsed, and Jim moved instantly, rolling to a new firing position before anyone could trace the muzzle flash. The forest erupted into chaos. Germans shouted in confusion, firing blindly. The reinforcements unleashed everything they had, tracers slicing through the dark like red lightning. Jim fought like a shadow, weaving through foxholes, firing, relocating, firing again. He didn't hold a position for more than a few seconds. He refused to let the enemy stabilize. He became the storm. He spotted a German officer raising a flare gun, ready to break the darkness and signal a coordinated charge. Jim fired. The officer fell. The flare hit the snow, fizzled, died. Darkness remained. The attack faltered. Jim knew what that meant. The window to break the assault had opened. If the Germans reorganized, they'd come again, harder. He didn't give them the chance. He vaulted out of his foxhole, sprinting across the ridge toward a cluster of advancing troops. He slid behind a fallen log as bullets tore through the branches above him. He pulled the pin on a grenade and lobbed it into the snowdrift where he'd seen their shadows. The explosion flashed. White screams followed Jim. Didn't wait. He advanced. He moved downhill, into the darkness, toward the enemy, not away. Snowflakes mixed with gunpowder on his eyelashes. His boots slipped on ice, caught traction, kept going. Another German appeared in front of him. Jim fired without stopping. He wasn't fighting for glory. He wasn't fighting to be remembered. He was fighting because men behind him depended on it. Men who would die if this ridge fell. A burst of automatic fire cut across his path. Jim dove behind a boulder, landing in the snow hard enough to knock the wind out of him. Machine gun tracers tore through the night, lighting up the trees like lightning. The gunner reloaded. Jim burst from cover. He didn't sprint. He charged. Snow sprayed behind him as he tackled the machine gunner into the dirt. They wrestled. The German tried to reach his sidearm. Jim grabbed the barrel of the machine gun, swung it like a club, and knocked him unconscious. He dragged the weapon up the hill, bracing the tripod in a shallow notch of rock. Now the Americans had a machine gun. Jim squeezed the trigger. The ridge thundered. Bullets stitched the snow, tearing through the German formation. Their assault collapsed. Troops turned and bolted into the darkness, leaving weapons behind, abandoning wounded men. The attack died under the weight of a single captured gun. He held fire as the last figures disappeared into the trees. Silence returned. Heavy, suffocating silence. Jim lowered the smoking machine gun and sank to his knees. His breath shook. The adrenaline drained out of him, replaced by cold creeping into his bones. He looked over the battlefield, over the ridge he had defended, over the broken assault, over the path where the Germans had run. He had done it again. He didn't just hold the ridge. He broke them, and morning was still hours away. Dawn approached slowly, the kind of winter dawn where the sky turns from black to steel gray without ever looking like morning. Snow still drifted sideways, pushed by wind that cut like a blade. The ridge, once a quiet hill in the Ardennes, was now soaked with gunpowder and history. The men who had fought through the night were exhausted. Some sat with heads bowed. Others reloaded magazines with trembling hands. No one spoke. Words felt too fragile after a night like that. Jim Hendricks leaned against the captured machine gun, staring downward into the forest. His uniform was torn, burned in places, and soaked from the snowmelt. His knuckles were raw. Blood, some his, some from others, stained his gloves, yet his eyes remained clear, focused, alive. He had fought off every German assault for nearly 20 hours, first alone, then with reinforcements, through day and night, through mortars, grenades, machine gun fire, and close combat. Most men would have collapsed. Jim didn't know how to stop. But the battle wasn't finished. He could feel something in the forest below. A tension. A presence. The Germans hadn't quit, not yet. They were regrouping again. He could hear faint movement. Muffled commands. Metal scraping against metal as belts of ammunition were loaded into weapons. They weren't done. Jim turned toward the senior surviving NCO. They're coming again. The sergeant swallowed hard. He wasn't a coward. He had simply seen enough. War to know when a fight was unwinnable. We can't hold another attack. Jim stared back down into the tree line. I'm not asking you to. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and stood at the ridge's forward edge. He was going back down. The sergeant caught his arm. "Hendricks, what in God's name are you doing?" Jim answered without hesitation, finishing it. He disappeared into the trees like a ghost. The other paratroopers watched him go, disbelief in their eyes. No one followed, not out of fear, but because they understood. Sometimes a moment belongs to one man. The forest swallowed him whole. Jim moved silently, lowering himself into the same snow-covered gullies the Germans had used to advance. He stepped where their boots had stepped. He stayed low, listening to the crunch of branches ahead. He spotted them. A German company, reorganized, weapons loaded, preparing to launch one final push. Officers traced lines in the snow with their bayonets, pointing to 3 attack routes. Machine gunners were being positioned. A runner distributed extra grenades. Jim, from behind a shattered tree, counted bodies. Too many. He couldn't stop them with bullets. He was nearly out of ammunition anyway. He couldn't stall them with grenades. He had none left. But the Germans had something he could use. A truck, covered by branches and camouflage netting, parked half a kilometer away down a narrow path. A fuel truck, the company's lifeline. Probably fuel for vehicles positioned farther down the route. If he could reach it, he didn't need to kill them. He just needed to stop them. Jim crawled through the snow, inching past patrols, past sentries, past men warming hands over a tiny stove. He reached the truck's rear wheel and ducked beneath the chassis. He spotted the fuel hoses, traced the line to the main tank, found the cap. He unscrewed it. The smell hit him. Gasoline, sharp and cold. He tore a strip of cloth from his torn uniform, stuffed it into the tank opening, letting it soak. His hands were numb. He could barely feel the knot he tied. He reached into his pocket, covering the matchbook he'd taken earlier during a search of a fallen German officer. 1 match. He struck it. Nothing. He struck again. The wind killed the flame instantly. He cupped his hands around the 3rd match, blocking the wind with his body. The flame flickered, weak but alive. Gasoline fumes curled around him. Voices emerged behind him. German guards. Jim looked at the match. He thought of his platoon on the ridge. He thought of the men sleeping in foxholes, praying they wouldn't be overrun. He thought of the road behind him, the one that led deeper into the Allied line. He released the match. The world exploded. A column of fire shot into the sky, roaring like a jet engine. The explosion rolled through the forest, knocking men off their feet and shattering the silence of dawn. Heat seared the air. Trees ignited. German soldiers scattered like ants. Jim was blasted backward. He hit the ground hard, ears ringing, lungs fighting for air, but he forced himself up. He staggered uphill, stumbling through the burning forest. Flames spread to crates of ammunition stacked near the fuel truck. Secondary explosions ripped through the campsite. Grenades detonating. Machine gun ammo cooking off in bursts. A chain reaction. The German company disintegrated into chaos. No attack, no formation, no ridge assault. Jim crested the hill, collapsing into the snow. The paratroopers rushed to him, pulling him back into cover as blasts echoed below. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. They could see everything in his eyes. Smoke rose from the valley. Thick, black, final. The German attack force was gone. Not defeated by artillery. Not stopped by a battalion. Stopped by a 19-year-old soldier with a box of matches. Reinforcements finally arrived. Armor, infantry, commanders. They fanned across the ridge, trying to make sense of what had happened. But when they asked the men who had survived, the answer was always the same. He did it. Jim Hendricks held the ridge. He stopped an entire German advance. A general approached Jim, still lying in the snow, exhausted. "Son," he said quietly, "you just changed the course of this battle." Jim looked up at him, voice barely a whisper. "I just held my position." He didn't know it yet, but medals were coming. Recognition. His name written into history, but not because he charged the enemy, not because he fought alone, because when the line was breaking, he refused to. Forever after, soldiers in the 17th Airborne told the story of the kid from Missouri who held a ridge against impossible odds, and every time, they ended it the same way. He fought like an entire army. The battlefield fell still. Smoke drifted through the trees like ghosts from a vanished army. The snow, blown into uneven drifts, was stained with black soot and frozen blood. Hours earlier, this had been a killing ground. Artillery craters, splintered trees, burned machines. Now it was quiet. American reinforcements arrived cautiously, expecting to find a wiped-out unit. or the frozen corpses of men who had held the line too long. Instead, they found him, the boy who refused to die, slumped against the wreckage of a tank destroyer, his face pale from blood loss, his uniform burnt and torn, hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. But his eyes were still open, still alert, still watching the tree line, just in case the Germans came back. He had been fighting for 1 hour and 15 minutes. Alone. When the officers asked, "Where are the Germans?" he looked across the snow-covered field, littered with bodies, and said quietly, "They're not coming." At first, nobody believed the full story. It sounded like a myth, a tall tale passed from foxhole to boost morale. Only when the soldiers walked the field, only when they counted the dead, only when they examined the burnt hulk of the tank destroyer with the Browning 50 cal welded in place by melted metal, did reality set in. One soldier had just stopped an entire German attack, not a squad, not a platoon, a full advance, infantry, machine guns, mortars, and armor support. They began to ask his name, and here is where our narrative must correct something. The platoon reports, the commendation forms, the eyewitness testimonies. They all pointed to one fact. The soldier on that burning tank destroyer was not an unknown farm kid named Jim Hendricks. His real name was Audie Murphy, 19 years old, from a Texas sharecropper family, not Missouri farmland, rejected by the Navy, rejected by the Marines, too small, too weak. He had lied about his age to get into the Army. He lied so he could serve. The official Army account would later document, he mounted the burning tank destroyer and fired the 50 caliber machine gun at the advancing enemy force for over 1 hour, despite his exposed position in heavy enemy fire. Not fiction, not legend, recorded history. Medics wrapped him in blankets and placed him gently on a stretcher. He kept asking one question, "Did we hold?" They told him yes. He closed his eyes, finally allowing himself to rest. The front line shifted again within days. Fresh divisions rotated in. New objectives, new weather reports, new plans. History moved on. But for those who survived because he stood his ground, that ridge in France was sacred. They never forgot the sight. One soldier, black smoke swirling around him, steam rising off hot metal, snow turning into ash beneath his boots, and the steady hammer of the Browning, cutting through the roar of artillery like a heartbeat. He had fought, until the barrel glowed. He had saved his unit. He had saved the line. The Army began paperwork. For the highest honor the United States could give, Audie Murphy was transferred to hospitals, then to a rehabilitation center. He carried deep shrapnel scars. His hearing was partially damaged. He limped when the weather changed. He woke from nightmares drenched in sweat, seeing German soldiers charging through the smoke again and again. But the medals kept coming. Silver Star, Bronze Star, Distinguished Service Cross, French Croix de Guerre, Belgian Honors, campaign ribbons. Every piece of metal represented a moment when he could have chosen to run. He never did. Finally, word came down from the highest authority. The White House, Audie Murphy, was to receive the Medal of Honor. January 1946, Washington. D.C. Murphy stood before the President of the United States. He was smaller than the other soldiers in the room, thinner. His uniform hung loose on his frame. He had lost weight during recovery. Reporters noted he looked more like a schoolboy than the most decorated soldier in American history. The citation was read aloud, a long list of impossible actions compressed into official language. When the Medal of Honor was placed around his neck, the room applauded. Audie didn't smile. He didn't puff out his chest. He looked down, eyes wet, and whispered, "This belongs to the boys who never came back." For the rest of his life, he would repeat the same sentence, to journalists, to veterans, to anyone who tried to call him a hero. The real heroes are the ones buried over there. Even after the war, he carried the front line with him. The noise, the fear, the responsibility of being the one who lived. Hollywood discovered him next. Studios offered contracts. Magazine covers called him the real Captain America. Movie producers attempted to dramatize his Medal of Honor moment using stuntmen. Audie refused. He said, "If the story is going to be told, I'll do it myself." So he stood again, under studio lights instead of artillery bursts, and reenacted the moment he fought alone against a German advance. Not because it was glamorous, but because he wanted America to understand what war really was. Not glory, not adventure, just courage in the worst conditions imaginable. The film was titled To Hell and Back, Audie Murphy played himself. The movie became the biggest box office hit in Universal Pictures history for 20 years. But the success didn't heal him. He slept with a loaded handgun under his pillow. He woke from nightmares roaring commands in German. He used his fame to speak openly about what no one in 1940s America wanted to discuss: post-traumatic stress. He fought a different war now, not against German soldiers, but against the invisible wounds carried inside. He became one of the first public figures to say, "War doesn't end when the shooting stops." He helped veterans get treatment. He pushed for mental health support. He used his platform not for ego, but for others. He never escaped the memories, but he never stopped fighting for those who did. Years later, decades, after the snow of Holtzwihr melted and the battlefield became just another quiet field in France, a historian stood at the ridge where Audie Murphy held the line. He ran his hand through the soil. He stared into the distance. He whispered what every soldier who survived that day already knew. One man changed history here. Not a superhero, not a comic book character, a skinny kid from Texas who refused to leave his friends behind. Not because he was fearless, but because he was brave anyway, and that is a far greater thing. Courage is not the absence of fear. Audie Murphy understood that better than anyone. On that frozen ridge in the Ardennes, facing a tide of enemy soldiers far stronger than himself, fear was constant. But courage is acting despite fear, and in that moment, one young man acted alone, determined, unyielding. History often remembers the movements of armies, the strategies of generals, and the numbers on maps. Yet sometimes, the course of battles rests in the hands of a single person. One rifle, one heartbeat, one decision that refuses to surrender. Murphy was that person. He held a ridge, delayed a battalion, and in doing so, safeguarded thousands of lives. His actions were small on a map, but monumental in their consequences. After the war, the medals, the fame, the Hollywood films, none of it captured the full weight of what he endured. He carried the memories of battle for the rest of his life, a constant reminder that heroism is often invisible to the world. It exists in moments of quiet determination, in acts performed not for glory, but because they must be done. Audie Murphy's story is more than a tale of warfare. It is a testament to resilience, to the strength of the human spirit when confronted with impossible odds. It reminds us that heroism does not require size, status, or expectation, but only the courage to stand when others cannot. Today, standing on that ridge, the snow long melted, the earth healed, it is impossible not to feel the echo of his actions. The footprints of a 19-year-old soldier in the frozen Ardennes left an imprint on history far larger than any map could show. In remembering Audie Murphy, we honor all who fight silently, who act bravely when the world seems against them, and who remind us that one person, in one decisive moment, can change everything. His courage, his determination, his unwavering stand. These are the legacy of America's real Captain America. And in that, we find a truth far more powerful than any medal, any movie, or any story. Courage is contagious, and the smallest of us can change the largest of worlds.